He's the most powerful being to have ever lived, and today we're going to explore the science behind him, assuming there's any to be found. Today we're talking about the science of Dr. Manhattan. Before we begin, if you like Comic Island, be sure to subscribe to our video, and to support us, check out our Patreon page in the video description below. So I thought it might be fun to try and tackle yet another one of the toughest characters I could possibly pick to do a science video about. There is a fun challenge to be had here. We're going to see what scientific ideas we can explore behind a character so powerful. He can essentially do anything he wants at any given moment without any sort of limit to it. Dr. Manhattan is basically a limitless being unconstrained by physics or the flow of time. He can thus move through the universe freely, fiddle around with the universe on a molecular level, and has few constraints. The question becomes, well, how the heck do I explain any of this? Let's start from the beginning. We know that John Osterman was locked up in some research station that was performing experiments on something called the intrinsic fields of objects. The idea behind them is there's some sort of innate form of energy that keeps objects intact, a sort of membrane that holds things together. They don't exist in our real world. Amusingly, if you look up intrinsic fields, you'll just find stuff about the Watchmen. When that field is tampered with, objects explode. John got caught in the research station, disintegrated, and a few months later, after appearing as a sort of ghostly figure, he finally figures out how to permanently reform himself into the ever-famous Dr. Manhattan version of himself. There's a lot to unpack there, but first, of course, we know nothing like this could really happen in our universe because the whole thing is predicated on a fictional phenomenon. But that's not really the point of this series, blah blah blah. You should get the drill if you've seen my Science of Superman or the Flash video. We're here to focus on the idea of things more than the plausibility of them. We'll never really know what happened to John here, but I've always been fascinated by this moment. Did John die? And Dr. Manhattan is some sort of weird all-powerful copy created in this experiment? What happened to his body that it apparently had to reform out of nothing? One explanation might be that John turned into some sort of pure energy that gave him control over the universe around him. When the intrinsic field membrane broke, his matter somehow turned into some form of pseudo-energy that could eventually find its way back into full-fledged matter. That's a lot of nothing in that statement I just made, just resting on the assumption that everything in the Watchmen universe is so different from ours that other forms of matter and energy make all of this possible, and we really don't have to dig any deeper than that. I think it's a bit inadequate, though, and we can do better by focusing on the physics of what happened to John. It is stated his work had to do with nuclear physics, because of course it did. It was inspired by the Manhattan Project, but that's really just chosen for the political and visual overtones. I think it's more interesting to focus on quantum mechanics, which provides a better explanation for Dr. Manhattan's powers. Quantum physics are a really cool field of study that can be intimidating due to its complexity. I wouldn't really say my knowledge of it is comprehensive enough to provide a full explanation of it here, but that would be pointless anyways, because I'm about to stretch it like crazy to suit our purposes, because Dr. Manhattan's nuts, and I gotta bend science a little bit to work with this thing. So don't get me wrong, it's all still nonsense. We are still talking about fiction, where our purposes lean more towards entertainment rather than accuracy. So, for our purposes, one key component of quantum physics is the spontaneous nature of uncertainty. Since we can't know the nature of a particle until we measure it, everything sort of exists across a scale of probabilities. These probabilities have sort of determined everything in your life, from what you ate for breakfast today to the very fact that our planet formed in the right place at the right time under the right conditions. All of these things were determined across a set of probabilities. You might have picked eggs today, the sun might have formed with one planet less than it did, but one way or another things happened a certain way, and once they did, there was no changing that. As much as everything kind of is random chance, it also is very deterministic. There's no rewriting the genes you were born with, for example, but there is a lot of random probability that goes into how they were formed out of your parents. Whatever happened to Dr. Manhattan, life is no longer so for Jonathan Osterman. He sees and travels through time in whatever order he might please, able to thus reorient the particles and probabilities of the universe in the past, present, and future. The only reason he doesn't do more is nicely explained in one scene in Doomsday Clock, where John encounters a couple of criminals. He knows that if he stops them, He will prevent a child from being born, and that child has a very interesting future. Some way, somehow, he has gained access to the switchboard of the universe. The cool part about it, so long as we're a little bit flexible with theoretical physics, is that quantum mechanics does explain a lot of Dr. Manhattan's powers. If you can not only understand reality down to the particle, but predict and alter it, you would be all-powerful, able to do just about anything you could imagine. You would be Dr. Manhattan. My idea is this: that experiment that created Dr. Manhattan makes objects somehow identify themselves as no longer existing. Whatever this machine does, it Schrödinger cats these objects, so to speak. They're somehow gone without any explanation or accounting for the loss of matter or energy contained within. They just no longer exist, violating a law or two of thermodynamics along the way. This is what happened to John, except unlike the objects, and note that his clothes or watch never came back, John had a conscious mind, which very much remembered itself still existing, itself having this matter and energy that were suddenly gone, and there was no accounting for it in the fundamental nature of the universe. That matter and energy, and likely matter and energy that went into that machine before, needed accounting for somewhere. But his matter and energy contained within his body never actually dispersed anywhere, like a sort of quantum switch going on to off. Here one moment, gone the next. Yet there was still something that remembered it existed, a being that did and did not exist. By this whole process somehow allowed him to change particles at will, and thus he changed his own particles slowly back into existence, building himself back particle by particle into something at least resembling a fancy new body. I don't think Dr. Manhattan has cells per se, but at least he's got a body form, and that's why it's all blue and weird looking. It's still an explanation with an awful lot of somehow involved in it, and weird, vague answers that I fully admit I can't fully explain and had trouble putting into words. I don't really think it's totally thought out as much as I tried to think it out. But it works as a sort of explanation to his powers and why he's so thoroughly able to affect the universe around him. The only question that remains is about the energy. Not so much the energy that was used to reform his body, but the energy that goes into the process of him reordering the universe at will. And considering that he was very weak at first, to the extent that nobody knew he still existed, I think John's energy comes from his own powers. Because remember, he can do anything, so assembling a body in such a way that it might be a walking fusion reaction, for example, wouldn't be difficult at all. All he would need to do is just sort of will that into existence, because that's how he is now. He can just make it that he was always sort of that way, that he always had access to this level of energy. It's a very fancy way of saying that Dr. Manhattan can basically know anything and do anything at any given point, given how his powers stretch across time, but that's the character as he's been established. That's his whole point. And I apologize if it's hard to wrap one's brain around it. I struggle with it too. I try to make it as simple as possible, and to explain it in words as simple as possible without getting into the laws of thermodynamics and atomic physics and all of that stuff. And this is about as adequate a scientific explanation as I think anyone's ever going to get, given that we are basically trying to explain how a god would be possible. And it should also be noted that at a certain point in writing this thing, I just sort of gave up on doing any further research than what I already had, even though at a certain point I had an instinct to do more. Just because I couldn't imagine any way that the finer elements of real quantum theory apply to such a powerful character as Dr. Manhattan. But it's fun to explore, and I think we can leave things there. I do like making these Science Up videos, so hopefully you enjoyed this one, and there's a lot of other characters out there to still talk about, ones that are a little easier to wrap our heads around. So if you have any suggestions for that, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. We'll see what catches my interest and kind of go from there, so stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching.